Hi, it's time for part two of Troy Demoulay's three-part journey into the world of integrated service management. Hopefully you tuned in last time for part one, where he explained what do we mean by integrated service management. Here's my 30-second summary. Not long ago, we spent almost all day every day figuring out how to use ITIL to improve our IT service management operations. ITIL wasn't straightforward. There were lots of processes to sort out, but at least it was just one big comprehensive body of knowledge. But more recently, there's been a kind of big bang. There's all of these other independently documented best practices we have to think about. Some of them are intended to fill in gaps or bring things up to date. Others just help us to focus on a bit more urgency or business alignment. I'm talking about DevOps, Agile, Lean, organizational change, etc., etc. This has made the ITSM landscape quite daunting again. And you might be thinking, what do I do with all of this stuff? Well, fear not, Troy's here. This week he'll explain two of the more valuable approaches to integrated service management. That's Agile and Lean. And you might even learn a little bit Japanese along the way today, but Agile and Lean are particularly vital because they help us to focus on results that are relevant and efficiencies as well. But that's enough from me. Let's get back to Troy, hear what he has to say about integrated service management, part two, combining frameworks to enable business value. Enjoy.
Hello, and welcome to this part two of a three-part webinar series on the concept of integrated service management. I am your host and speaker today, Troy Demoulay's, Vice President of Research and Development at Pink Elephant. So our focus today is going to be looking at a bit more detail in the context of how does the integrated service management concept work together. In the first of the three-part series, we talked about the puzzle. How do all the pieces come together? What are their interplay? How do they interconnect? And how do we make sense of all of these models and frameworks? Today, we're going to look more about the application, using some of the lean and agile practices many organizations are developing and pursuing, which I'll address in a few minutes, to see how these work together as opposed to isolated activities. The third and final part of the series will be looking at the more structural teaming aspects of how our organizations, through leadership and teaming models, applying these concepts to bring more of a cultural and behavior change. So let's begin by talking about where we are as an industry. So every year we look at research at Pink Elephant. That's part of my title, Research and Development. And one of the areas that we do that is at something called a Pink Think Tank. It's something we do annually at our major annual event in February. And every year we have a theme based on emerging trends and concepts, in this case, integrated service management. And there's been a question we've asked for several years running in a row now. And that is, okay, folks, based on where you are right now, your business pressures, the external drivers you're facing, what are the models, the frameworks, the concepts that you're pursuing right now? And it's a many kind of select question, so they don't have to kind of choose. It's really about, we're trying to find a way to understand where are the current focus areas. Not that these don't represent areas which are no longer important. We'll see here that waterfall seems to be something of a lower percentage, but the question was really posed in the sense of today, this year, what is your current focus? And what we've seen is that organizations are undoubtedly adopting these practices that we're talking about in the concept of integrated service management. There's been a significant rise in the use of agile development practices. Today we're going to be focusing on how those practices are moving beyond just software development into project management and even more generally into simply planned work. But also the concept of lean. And in the first session we talked about how lean is the evolution and the basis for many of these emerging models around accelerating value. How are they applying those concepts? And then in DevOps, these three areas that you're seeing here in the purple, the reddish color, and the blue are definitely the emerging concepts. That doesn't mean that organizations aren't still applying and focusing on service management or even still practicing waterfall, more classic linear project management where that makes sense. It's simply where do they need to spend energy and focus at this point. So it's without a doubt, over the last 3 years, we've seen this graph grow in the context of a much now kind of more, I'd say, varied approach to different models and frameworks. So it stands to reason why we need a way to integrate these things. Now, the key premise that we keep talking about around this concept of integrated service management is that these are not standalone. They don't operate in isolated islands. Unfortunately, that's how we often see them implemented. We keep having to talk about the fact that we work and live in an enterprise value system. And in this value system, there's a set of activities and or practices for taking customer demand through an engagement philosophy, and that can be strategic engagement through business relationship management, a tactical type of engagement through a catalog and request fulfillment, an operational type of engagement through a service desk and a call center. But in essence, we have this front door aspect that we looked at in the first session. Those demand intake capabilities then produce a plan for what we need to do around our portfolio, how we modify, how we spend time refactoring, reducing technical debt, or creating net new value. That then brings us to the point that value is not delivered until it's delivered, right? Until it's actually in an operational sense. And so you have this supply chain, if you will, where we take demand in one side and we produce value out the other. And this context of how do we provide value to the organization has to constantly be looked at in this linear value system approach. Now, it's also important to understand that there are certain capabilities that overarch the overall value system, being that they don't apply to one state, but they apply to the overall, right? Regardless of what the state is of demand and supply. So portfolio, strategy generation, we have the concept of external requirements and governance in a legality aspect. And then there are capabilities that underpin. And those underpinning capabilities are around continual improvement, around architecture, around security. Again, they don't happen in a linear sense, but they apply to the overall value chain and look at it systemically. So I want you to remember, as we talk about lean and we talk about agile, we're focused mostly on probably the center line on this graph, where we're taking demand and we're producing supply, in essence, the supply chain. The challenge we faced in the historical perspective is that because of various reasons that impact both structure and culture and process, we haven't been very good at, or fast at, I could say that, taking demand and producing supply, because we've had a very variable approach doing that. We've had a lot of fragmentation, a lot of silo-based thinking, and we haven't looked at it as an end-to-end system or value chain in essence. And we've had to apply lean and agile and DevOps practices to kind of reconstitute what has been artificially broken down or broken apart, if you will, over the past decades. So, lean provides us this context from the beginning because it's been around since the 1940s, and it's been applied to organizations every single time they hit this challenge where the incoming demand is actually greater than or faster than the ability to supply. And so in essence, imagine we have this backlog growing in front of this supply chain. And that, of course, creates tension between the people requesting and the people supplying. And so at some point, when either commoditization or competitive drivers or external pressure comes to bear, organizations have to lean out their value system, create better flow, bringing balance between demand and supply. The interesting thing is that this context of demand and supply inequity hasn't hit the IT organization all at the same time, right? On the front end of the value chain, up near the customer engagement plan build side, we've had the software development folks for, forever. And they've had to deal with the fact that they have this growing demand for moving faster. So in the 1990s, mid-90s, and then late 2000s, the development community took on many of the practices of lean. They broke the large project into smaller bite-sized chunks. We called them sprints now. Lean would call them small batch versus big batch. It focused on applying visual management tools, and we'll see that now looking at Kanban boards and visual management aids around dashboards. It's looking at work in progress. It's really about how do we create better feedback loops and move in a more improved flow perspective, reduce waste, bring a better flow to the front end of the value chain. The challenge that we found with that context occurred about 5 to 7 years ago. And again, a lean teaching teaches us that if you accelerate only one part of the overall end-to-end value chain, what you're actually going to get is where you move your backlog down to the point you haven't considered as part of your overall optimization step. So imagine we're getting better flow, increasing the feedback loops, increasing the build and the move to production in the first few stages of demand capture, planned, and build, but we haven't included the move to production, the change, the release in this context. So what happens here is we now move all of that now backlog from the front of the value chain now to this step that means move to production. Another lean teaching teaches us that if we overburden any given task in the overall value system, that task doesn't actually go faster by receiving the gift of additional backlog. It actually becomes overburdened, overwrought, overwhelmed. We see more defect, we see more challenges needing for rework. And so by not including the entire value system in the optimization, we actually decrementally impact the entire value system. And so about 5 to 7 years ago, we saw this emerge with books like the Phoenix Projects and various folks speaking about the principles of DevOps. And really it was, can't we all work together? Can't dev and ops actually work on the same team within the context of a same value system? Because it was really in the trenches of release engineering that the DevOps movement emerged and kind of grew out of, where the cry was stop the insanity. Can't we now optimize the whole value system? And so while DevOps has grown since its emergence as focused on that release engineering move to production step, it was really initially focused as a reaction to the fact that the Agile optimization was too narrow in scope and we had the impact on this move to production step. So DevOps, in essence, is in part a reaction to Agile being too narrow in its scope of optimization. Now, the interesting thing to note is that both Agile and DevOps have derived from lean thinking and practices. And so in one sense, you can think of lean actually having a few love children along the decades. In the 1980s, we saw the emergence of Six Sigma. In the early or mid-1990s and early 2000s, we have Agile coming to fruition, the Agile Manifesto being published in 2000, and now we see the emergence of DevOps. So I want you to think about Agile and DevOps deriving from initial lean practices. We talked about that in the first of the 3 webinars, but we're going to revisit that a little bit in the next slide. All right, so thinking about how do we now use these contexts together. It's important that we understand if we're going to improve some of the demand capture activities, that we need to learn a few lessons from lean in the context of what's called voice of customer and critical to quality. So lean makes a major focus or places a major focus on value, and value is of course defined by the customer, and this customer context is basically the organization or group who is receiving and consuming the value delivered. So I don't want you to get too hung up about the word customer. It's simply who is receiving value, and that group, that organization is going to be the basis for how we define value. Now, lean gives us a number of tools for establishing voice of customer, and it talks about customer segmentation, how to establish which is the most important customer, because the reality is not all customers are created equal. How do we take the voice of customer through a series and a variety of different channels for input through a grid that helps us to understand which are requirements, which are wishes. And as we get into requirements, we can think about now, how do we measure specifically whether we have achieved value and or not. This is the translation of critical to quality into specific performance measurements or key performance indicators, if you will. So there's a lot to be learned from lean when we talk about how do we start prioritizing work, because a key thing that Agile talks about is that we have this product backlog. And this product backlog is a list of all possible work we have to do, but all of that work cannot have the same priority. We have to be constantly considering how do we prioritize the work based on an external perspective that lean would call voice of customer. So the product owner, we'll be talking about more in this session, is constantly reevaluating, listening to voice of customer. Now, another key thing, if you're a lean advocate, you'll know that there are more than one voice. There's, of course, voice of business, there's voice of regulation, even voice of process. So this constant balancing of the various inputs for prioritization, Lean gives us a lot of specific tools for how to do that. Another aspect that we get from Lean that is very important is that it brings work into context of three different activities. Value-added work, necessary but non-value, we can call that administrative work if you will, and then non-value. And in the context of those three things, it helps us to create rules around what do we standardize, what do we simplify. So value-added work, of course, is the focus. We're trying to optimize that, right? Focus most of our energy on that. And we're going to then look at the other two types of work, if we can classify this correctly, and say, while it is necessary, how do we minimize necessary non-value? The administration, the governance side of things is critical because without it, the process becomes unglued. But too much over time, of course, becomes a non-value conversation. So if it's necessary non-value, we minimize it. We don't try to maximize it or even optimize it. We try to find a fit for purpose just enough. The, of course, third category of work, the non-value, is a candidate for, extreme elimination, if you will. So we look at work through the lenses of Lean. It helps us to make good business cases for how do we reduce work. In essence, you probably have heard the statement, do more with less. In fact, that's not a Lean concept. Lean would say you're doing too much work right now, too much necessary non-value, too much non-value. The real question that Lean brings to the table is how do we do more by doing less, creating, of course, more capacity for doing more value-added work. Now, of course, Lean is going to demonstrate and show us all kinds of issues with the value stream. It's going to show us where waste is, where there's too much waiting going on, where we have rework, we have defects, we have inventory issues. It makes visible the invisible, which is a principle called Jidoka. We'll come back to in a minute. But when you have identified all these potential opportunities, right, we're an environment that's target rich, how do I eliminate them? Lean gives us specific problem-solving tools, leveraging a Kaizen mindset and problem-solving methodology. Other frameworks do some, decent work in this area. ITIL would talk about problem management, but really only from an IT incident management perspective. Lean has a much more broad perspective on when we have a deviation from expected norm, when things aren't the way they should be, how do we go about solving that? Probably the closest you would get to something that would provide tangible capabilities for problem solving might be Kepner Trago, but I find the Lean gives us a more broad perspective on how to do this. Visual management, this is a tool that's been, of course, leveraged heavily in the Agile and the DevOps space, almost as if you don't realize that they come from Lean capabilities and Lean thoughts. Another aspect, performance metrics. Agile speaks a lot about user experience, right? So it's talking about cycle time and lead time. Well, these measures actually begin with Lean concepts. What's the end-to-end throughput of the value system? Escape defects is something that, of course, Agile has been able to take onto board. The improved velocity of sprints. Again, this would be shortened cycle times, which is the end-to-end work time frame. Small batch, work in progress limits. This is an interesting one. As we look at a Kanban example in a few minutes, I'll be talking a lot about how studies show that too much work in progress actually limits or constrains flow. And the principle of, again, we talked about this earlier, if you overburden any given step, that step will actually begin to denigrate in speed. So how do we actually create more velocity through limiting what can be worked on at any given time is a primary Lean premise. And of course, everyone knows that if you have heard of the word Lean, what we're trying to get rid of here is that non-value and necessary non-value minimization. All of this is the basis of how do we continually improve the flow of work left to right through those practices which take demand and produce supply. So I wanted to give a quick recap on the Lean concepts here as we look at the Agile aspects, because a lot of what you're seeing here on this slide will now work its way into how Agile has focused on how do we increase speed and agility. So this now brings us to the principle of Jidoka. It's a Japanese word meaning to see the invisible. And the principle behind this concept is fairly simple in that it's impossible to govern, to manage, to improve that which we cannot see. So this very much applies to the world of knowledge work, and where many of our processes cross boundaries into different teams, where a lot of the work that actually happens, in inboxes, in various queues which are not contiguous and aren't seen as one whole. So the principle of seeing, to see is to govern, is to be able to improve, is key here. And this finds expression in the various visual management tools that Lean brings to the table, that Agile and DevOps have taken on board. Of course, the most famous being the Kanban, but there are different tools that Lean talks about. Of course, there's very much the concept of a dashboard, or the concept of a key performance indicator, providing a rolling 12-month perspective. These are tools that enable us to engage, to improve. The other side of Jidoka, though, and this will come back when we talk about self-management and self-managing teams, is that it's not enough to simply make visible the invisible, to make mistakes and potential challenges for waste and rework and defect visible. It's important that you then enable the people doing the work to do something about it. So this is the principle where in Toyota they have the and-on cord. And the and-on cord is enabling any individual on the shop floor to stop the line once a defect is identified, to not pass that defect further down the line. These concepts have been picked up in the Agile and the DevOps space in the principle of shifting quality left, or back up the line, if you will. So it's great to be able to express this in this kind of way, both the visualization, but also the enablement of the the autonomy of the individual to do something about it. So take a look now at an example. Of course, the Kanban board is probably the most famous because it's the one we see often, and this is an example from a vendor called leankit.com, and there are many different vendors out there that provide a virtual tool and concept. The reason I picked this example is because I really like the way that it displays different types of work. First of all, a simple Kanban board is to show and demonstrate how work is either in queue, the concept of a product backlog, pick for next in line, right? That's your, what's moving into work in progress next. But what I really like about this principle is it not only shows the status of work, but it also shows different types of work being applied to this. Now, either it's an individual or it's a team. So there's the principle of planned work. We see that represented by the green sticky notes here. But of course, unless you are dedicated to planned work and you have no aspect or relationship to break fix, right? Other things happen. You have unplanned work where if you're involved in developing it, you might be asked to support it, and that's production issues. And there's also simply the concept of being surprised by joy. It's demand coming from other sources than normal channels. So these are all real aspects that happen in a day-to-day life of an average IT professional. The challenge we often get into, especially with classic project management, is we only focus on planned work. And this is kind of the challenge of all project managers. They have this assumption, they've been given the best intention of the people working on their project, that they have a certain percentage capacity time to work on a project. But the reality is that very few people track how much time is actually spent in non-planned work, both break fix or otherwise. And so for most people, the reality is that the majority of time that they actually spend is not on planned work, but in other areas. It's critical to make this visible. Back to the principle of Jidoka. You can't govern what you cannot see. The other principle, again, is back to work in progress limitation, right? The more work we have in progress, the more plates we have in the air, the more challenges we're going to have, because we're going to do too much context switching. There's going to be more error and defect, thereby reducing the overall quality, but also the flow of work. So this is an example that I like, using a Kanban board. It's one of many different tools that demonstrate how we can use planned work, but also unplanned work. Now, I'm going to make a statement later when I talk about using Agile Scrum for more than just development, that it's a great thing for planned work. The Kanban system, as you see here, is beyond the Scrum concept. It can actually contain both planned and unplanned work, and it should, in my opinion. So let's take us to Agile. So according to the fount of all wisdom here, Wikipedia, a set of principles which basically evolve through collaboration, self-organization, cross-functional teams, and these are all good. But the principle of Agile, I want you to think about that word Agile. What words come to mind? What adjectives come to your mind when you think about the word Agile? Maybe words like nimble, flexible, the ability to be able to move in a different direction quickly. Perhaps the concept of speed also comes into mind, which is, of course, right, because Agile both means the ability to change direction, the agility, but also there's a principle of moving faster flow. The challenge that I'd like to put in front of everyone is that the concept of agility requires systems thinking to work properly. Imagine that you have this value chain we've talked about so far, people involved in the front end of engagement, people involved in plan and build, people involved with operate. Now imagine each of these groups is trying to be agile, but they do not share common belief, common practice, and common priority. They don't have a shared sense of what comes first, second, and third. Each is being agile, though, in completely different directions. So what would happen to a system of value where each group is being agile, quote unquote, be able to move quickly and change directions, but they're not doing that in a uniform way? So this is why lean thinking brings us back to systems thinking. You have to think about the system as a totality. For the system to be collectively agile, they have to share belief, practices, and priorities. So the principle here is that it's not virtuous for development to be agile or have different flavors of agile, and then operations to be agile and have a different way of doing that. There has to be some cohesion to agility for the system to be collectively agile. A key thought here. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about the difference between predictive and adaptive project management. We touched on this briefly in the first session. I'm going to go deeper into this, how Agile is becoming quickly the most basically sought after and implemented project management methodology. And that's because much of the work we do in the IT side of the business is about adaptivity for innovation. So Waterfall, based on its original intent, was designed to create a set of distinct steps that were completely complete before we start the next, meaning that we've got the stage gate signed off, we know we have got all of our I's dotted, our T's crossed, if you will, before we move on to the next step. And there's some advantages to this. We've got to make sure, especially when we have a tightly coupled build, that we have dependencies outlined, that we know specifications for one piece that needs to fit into another piece. So when you're building a predefined blueprint for a fighter jet, for example, we're not going to adapt and kind of iteratively find our way to that, replication. Now, to qualify that, we might do prototyping and the original development of that fighter jet in more of an adaptive approach. But once the blueprint is set, we're going to move to a more predictive waterfall model. So the principle of predictive is that it's a very good and detailed way of working when you know what the requirements are and you can predict what those requirements are ahead of time. Meaning we've built this before, or we know what we're going to build, and we're going to build another one. Right? So we're going to build a bridge, we're going to build a house based on a blueprint, we're going to build a network. We're not innovating our way there. So when it comes to standard build, to replicate consistently, repeatedly, it's actually advantageous to use a waterfall design. However, when it comes to innovation, to build something we've never actually done before, it actually is a bit, silly to consider that we could predict all of the requirements on the front end on an innovation-based project, right? It comes largely because of the tensions in typical practices like financial management, strategy. We want to basically be able to say, before I embark in this, invest in this activity, I want to predict what my fixed budget, my fixed timeline is going to be. I have to know this, but I've never built it before. So it's a bit of a paradox here if you find, follow the analogy. So where we are building and replicating something we've built before, let's face it, engineering practices haven't changed for, hundreds of years, then that makes sense. But when we're innovating towards something, it makes sense that we're going to move towards more of an adaptive model. The other thing I want to just point out before I kind of move on here, and I'll come back to this when I hit the iteration discussion, is note that the test step on the waterfall happens at the end of this life cycle. Now, that's an interesting premise, because let's say we're working a project 4 to 6 months long, and now we're getting ready to do, before we move it to production, we're going to do a quality assurance, we're going to do a test step, so that make sure that whatever we put into production isn't going to fail when it gets there, right? Cause nasty impact. The challenge with that is, there's a premise. The longer we take before we test and validate something, the more difficult it will be able to see if there are any errors. And if we even do see them, then the more costly and challenging and difficult it's going to be to back ourselves out of them. So here's what typically happens. You implement this test quality assurance step at the end of a large project. We may not see everything, but let's say we do see some things. We obviously are going to see some defects. But then the cost and the implication of actually recovering from them would hit the budget and hit the timeline in such a negative way. We, cross our fingers and say, okay, known defect. We give ourselves the excuse all systems go live with known defects, and we let it ride, right? Because to pay the price on cost and budget is too difficult. However, the end result is the user experience gets that they get to experience all those known defects, and the resulting customer satisfaction impact. The interesting thing is that Dr. Deming, kind of the father of quality, himself said it's impossible to inspect quality at the end of a life cycle. It needs to be built into the entire life cycle overall. And this is the principle of shifting left again. So this is where Agile comes in. So let's imagine we're moving towards more of a innovation, adaptive approach. It's important to note that we're not skipping any steps, that we're actually completing the full life cycle that we saw in the previous slide, but we're doing it in much tighter iterations or time frames. And the other principle of this is that you'll note plan, design, build, test happens within each iteration. The testing is happening as, practically as close to the build phase as possible. We build it, we test it, we build it, we test it. And if we're following XP, test-driven development principles, we've actually built the test before we write the code, enabling us to, of course, write the code more efficiently and automate the test. But in essence, we're apt to discover things more readily, quicker, earlier in the life cycle. And the cost and the implication for actually recovering and not passing that quality issue left now, of course, goes down. We're more apt to actually address customer experience issues in each iteration. So it's not that we're giving up or foregoing any of the discipline of standard build and test, but it's happening in a much tighter iteration. So it's important to note is that we're not doing multiple build iterations, and at the fourth iteration, not on this slide, right, we're putting in a test and quality assurance sprint. That's not the intent of Agile, and also going to still, not repair or fix the issues we just addressed. So this concept of, tighter iterations also has another benefit, which is we're getting a sooner perspective from the customer, the consumer, whether what we've built, the prototype, the wireframe, whether that meets their needs or not. And this conversation we're going to have we talk about an Agile Scrum process, will build a mandatory feedback loop called a review before the next iteration goes forward, allowing us to adapt scope if necessary. So let's take a look at one of the probably better known Agile methods, and there are many out there. It's Agile Scrum. It's one of the probably the more straightforward, most defined, more structured approach. An interesting point about structure. Many people think of the word Agile meaning non-structure. Actually, when you think about the disciplines of Agile Scrum, it has more structure than the average development or project methodology. And that's actually one of its benefits. It gives discipline where discipline is needed. But back to the lean principle, it restricts that discipline into a specific number of events and artifacts, meaning it's trying to minimize the necessary non-value into, yeah, you're going to have meetings, but you're only going to have so many, right? And those meetings can only be so long, right? They're time boxed. So it doesn't allow for kind of the expansion of necessary non-value beyond what is necessary and meaningful. So to kind of walk through an example of how to use Agile in a non-development or additional to development capability, I'm going to take a few moments to describe Agile Scrum. So it begins with the beginning of who is, involved in the conversation, who are part of an Agile team. And so the Agile Scrum team, which is the circle to the right, has three specific roles: the product owner, the Scrum Master, the development team. Only three, by the way. And there's a reason for that I'll come back to in a minute. But let's start with the product owner. This product owner, as you're seeing, is also connected to a left-hand circle. They're connected to a larger ecosystem. They're not creating truth unto themselves. They're connected to who are my stakeholders? Who's paying for this? Who's requesting it? What do they need it to look like, right? There's a conversation ongoing on a regular basis with the customer perspective. There's also other models that are brought to bear, right? There's the regulatory, the financial conversation, the other voices that Lean talks about. So this product owner is balancing all these voices, is going to be highly responsible for creating a prioritization in the product backlog. The total list of work, not all work is equal. What is the work that has the highest value in the product backlog? This is going to come from an external perspective that the product owner will represent back to the development team. The development team, note that you don't see QA specialist or developer or architect or security professional. One of the challenges that Agile so nicely does address is the fact that is dealing with creating cross-functional teams which leave their egos at the door. You're not allowed to bring your title to the development team. It doesn't matter what you did in your functional role, but when you're attached to this team, you're a development team member. And that's important because it's explicitly done that way to ensure that you don't bring to this team this concept of this is my box, right? That's my job and that's not my job over there. No. A self-managing team self-organizes around the work and they collectively support each other when capacity and other issues arise. This is an important principle of Lean. There is no such thing as I am a such and such and I don't do so and so, or I don't do X, Y, and Z, whatever that is. Now the Scrum Master is not a project manager as in the context of traditional project management, but is a person responsible for the process of the Scrum process and the roles that we're describing now to ensure that discipline and structure is applied. But it's more of a coaching role, that's why you see the whistle, than it is any kind of directing role. It makes sure that the various roles involved in the process know their responsibilities and do those responsibilities. For example, a self-managing team will be able to self-manage its own selection about how much work it takes from the backlog. However, it doesn't take any work from the backlog. It only takes the top prioritized work, top shelf, if you will. And then what it does take and commit to get done within a given iteration or sprint has to be also equal the experience that team's been able to provide over time. So, it's not like I can give myself a light sprint this time because the Scrum Master will be keeping track of the amount of work done over the previous iterations and will encourage the team to take on the full workload it's demonstrated it's capable of doing, right? So there's a voice of a conscience, if you will, the Scrum Master plays here. So these three roles are heavily engaged and invested in the process we're going to look at now. So looking at the left, starting at the left here, we're looking at the product backlog with the word groom, right? Back to who's responsible. This is the product owner, making sure that the work is prioritized according to the external context, and making sure that as work moves from the bottom to the top of this list, more and more details available for the final stage of where the work is now pulled off the top of the product backlog into the quote-unquote sprint. Now, back to the self-managing aspect of the team, they do get to choose what they pull off the top according to their historical ability to get work done. They're going to then move into an additional planning. This is usually the first day of a sprint and a maximum of 8 hours, and they are taking the top of that backlog. They're creating more detail around it, estimating what's going to happen with who and who's going to do what. And this sprint backlog now becomes the work that they agree to complete within the next 1 to 4 weeks, depending on this, the length of your sprint. Now, the key thing here is that we're going to also meet daily as a development team, because as they have now, worked together to decide who's doing which work, they have to also realize that they're often dependent on each other. So every day they meet in a stand-up meeting, a sprint meeting, and they say, okay, here's what I did yesterday, here's what I plan to do tomorrow, here's my blocks. Why? We're creating transparency that allows inspection. And the transparency happens in multiple places. It happens in the backlog, it happens in the sprint backlog, it happens in the work we're planning to get done today. Because if through that transparency we can inspect and see that there's an issue that needs to be adjusted, we don't wait to the end of the sprint. We fix it now, wherever that becomes available. And this is the principle of adapt. So these three words create transparency. Does that remind you of something? Jidoka, right? Make the invisible visible. That allows me inspection, which is analysis. It allows me to adapt. Now, the final aspect of this comes in the next three stages of this process, right? At the end of each sprint, whether that's 1 or 4 weeks maximum, a sprint review must occur. That is, okay, the work we've done, who is the key stakeholder consumer for it? Let's review that, do a demo, right? Dog and pony show with them to say, okay, here's what we did. Did this meet your need, or did we hit the mark, or did we miss it? So there's a review or a feedback loop. The beauty here is that at maximum every 4 weeks, there's a review feedback loop with basically people requesting or funding the work. That makes them feel that something's happening. That gives them a sense of momentum and value received. But it also gives them a chance to say, well, I thought that was where I wanted to go, but now I see it. I have 3 more ideas, right? So that allows us to adapt the scope to make this work more specifically for the need it was meant to, versus waiting to a 6-month project before we do user acceptance testing. Now again, transparency, inspection, adaption. The final one, which is probably my favorite, which is the sprint retrospective. One of the disciplines of Agile Scrum is that before the team can actually then start another loop, get through this process again, they need to sit down in a team retrospective where they look at continual improvement. What worked well, what didn't work well, and how do we get better at the next turn of the crank, if you will. And these are disciplines. And the Scrum, the Scrum coach here is going to make sure that these disciplines are followed. Because if you're not following the disciplines of Scrum, then you're not doing Scrum. And in this case, losing out on many of the benefits that I've described so far. All right, now, everything I've described to you has been a generic so far, introduction of what Agile Scrum is. I want to talk to you about now, how does this apply to other practices and how does this integrate? So in the ITIL space, we have something called a service owner. And the service owner is often represented as kind of the entrepreneur responsible for a service or capability within an organization. They're ensuring that the service continues to remain relevant, that it changes over time to meet the needs of its consumers and or the business. And so this service owner is constantly modifying and managing the service lifecycle, if you will, right? Now, how does this differ from Agile's concept of the product owner we've been talking about? Or are they the same person with different roles and responsibilities? Well, I can tell you right off the bat, that's my perspective. So imagine, using our metaphor here, your restaurateur needs to meet with the banker, needs to meet with investment stakeholders, needs to sell a business case, and this person is talking at a strategic level with a series of external parties, maybe doing some focus groups, seeing what kind of food people like to eat, but there's this outside voice coming in. Now, through this conversation, it's established, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we built a patio, a sidewalk patio? So now, having all of the context that this person now knows is important, including the the community regulation for bylaws and compliance, that person turns to the internal build team, the contractors, puts the hard hat on, if you will, and says, okay, we're going to build this now add-on to the restaurant that we're running here, and these are the specifications for success, and these are the pieces of work we want to see done first, second, and third in the context of priority. So rather than thinking of these as different people, think about them as the same type of person with different perspectives based on the context they're currently working in. Now, I also want you to think about this, back to this concept of planned versus unplanned work. So there are many elements of planned work that happen in the value chain. And these could be strategic at the front end where we're having, there's major projects, yes, but now we have more enhancement or business as usual type of things we have to manage, right? There's the typical service request fulfillment process, employee onboarding, problem management, access management. What all of these things have in common is that there's a list of work that has to get done, that all that work has to be somehow prioritized, and that the work has to get done within agreed time frames, and ideally it meets the need of the customer that's requested it, and that can we not get better at collaborating around it every time we turn the crank, if you will. So I want you to think about extending this Scrum and Agile concept and all the benefits that come with it now to more than just development and projects, but to planned work. Opportunities can come out of this as, improvement options, which can also be put back into the backlog, by the way. And so this becomes part of the ITIL Continual Service Improvement Register. Or it could be identifying an opportunity for a Kaizen event. And by the way, this cross-functional team aspect, it didn't start with an Agile. Actually, Lean and the Kaizen event concepts and now DevOps with the DevOps team have extended it again. But more on cross-functional teams, which is a pitch for my third webinar coming up in the next of the 3 webinar series. All right, so I want you to imagine using these Agile concepts now for more than just build. Even, let's take it a step further. Let's say we're going to do a transformation project around a process like change management. You could, and many organizations do, say we're going to create this, re-engineer this process soup to nuts, right? A to Z, and we're going to put it in a tool, and when we're going to get this tool all automated and ready to roll out, then we're going to do this massive kind of rollout strategy across the organization. I've been in many of those projects, and that end-to-end cycle time is typically 3 to 4 months before we see any value. And a lot of times it suffers from attrition, and the reality is people get frustrated. They're not seeing value fast enough, or don't have whenever it comes out doesn't meet the need of the organization that originally charted the requirement. Why not take all the advantages of our Agile Scrum process and apply it to a process deployment like this? So we, sprint 1, let's just figure out the change, risk, and approval model. Who approves what? How do we move more changes to pre-approved and automation? Sprint 2, let's get the advisory board structure and the meeting cadence going. Sprint 3, how do we standardize many of the changes coming through the manual process today? Now, you could, because it is potentially shippable, deploy each of these sprints, and so we're actually receiving the value of each sprint as we go along. Or you could simply say, in the spirit of continuous delivery, not deployment, we're creating a feedback loop, we're creating the ability to tweak and tune this in a much shorter iteration, providing that whatever gets done at the now full package release, which includes perhaps all of the sprints as one release, much more customer involvement in design and development, creating more momentum, creating more interest, and the viability of the process goes up. So it's an example, but it's I think a good one to describe how you could actually use these principles we've talked about to actually leverage planned work outside. And I keep saying planned work because it doesn't make sense to bring in break fix and such like that. But you can, as we talked about earlier, have that on the Kanban board. So I hope that these examples have helped to kind of extend the concepts of lean and agile to more than just the traditional development space, because that's what many organizations are doing today, because the principles of transparency, inspection, adaption, feedback loop, continual improvement, making sure that we are able to identify defects quicker so that we can actually fix them. All of these things are virtuous and create improved quality and flow. So the principle of integrated service management. Now, process is only one part of this. The next part we're going to address in the next of the 3 series is organizational structure, leadership, and culture. So make sure you tune in to the next of the 3. Take care and have a great day.